Letter 26. Fast and Furious Knots. Dear Lady Mary, another similarity between our Turkish experiences is that we both witnessed the country during periods of significant social and cultural evolution. You lived there during the Tulip era, a time during which the Ottoman Empire opened up to Western ideas and models. I, too, encountered a period of notable change, especially in the 1980s, when Turkey again looked attentively at Western notions and lifestyles. Traveling to Turkey every year has allowed me to notice the slight and not so slight changes in lifestyle. Enough time passes between visits to allow me to count the number of these bricks of change being laid in the foundation wall of a developing Turkey. Each year, certain differences would distinctly jump out at me, and I dutifully noted them, even the most trivial, in my travel journals. Some things, of course, never change in Turkey. The smell of lemon cologne, the chaos of Eminönü, the sonorous blasts of the horns of the Bosphorus ferries, the muezzin's call, the smell of grilling lamb, the tinkle of spoons in tulip-shaped tea glasses, the taste of Kanlıca yogurt, or the color of the fawn hills of Anatolia. But each year, many new sensations are built upon these eternal foundations. I have always been struck by the irony that the geographical contours of the country of Turkey follow the same golden rule proportional system, 2:3, that carpets do. In many ways, I see the knotted carpet as the symbol for the modern Turkey now being woven, a carpet in which you can see the patterns of the past and the colors of the future. The loom of this carpet is the geography of Turkey itself. Its mountains, fault lines, forests, and seas. A loom as sturdy as those 500-year-old plane trees you see so often. This loom is strung with vertical warp threads, representing the basic, traditional Turkish societal values of religion, customs, language, and family structure. The horizontal red wefts passing through these warps are the shoots of innovation and progress that keep driving this Turkey rug upwards to completion, and which also hold each successive row of knots in place. Finally, I see the woolen knots tied to these warps and wefts as a particular spin and twist given to this tradition and change. The choice of the colors of the wool and how the patterns of these knots will be designed, interpreted, and embellished remain in the hands and eye of the weaver herself. In this case, the people of the Republic of Turkey. When a weaver sits in front of an empty loom and picks up the wool for her first row of knots, she has already laid out the rug's pattern in her mind's eye. Yet she is also well aware that her intended pattern may not always come out as she planned, and that her knotting tension will vary daily. A rug, like life, sets out with firm intentions, but is adjusted on the fly. I have seen months and years of knotted rows climbing up the loom of my Turkey carpet, and right now the knots are flying fast and furious as this rug strives to reach the top of the loom. Yet it would seem that there are two sets of hands tying those fast and furious knots. These two pair of hands belong to two different weavers, each one bringing a different strength, pull, and tension to the knotting process. One pair of hands belongs to the craftsman of modern Turkey, and the other pair to traditional Turkey. These two pairs of hands can be seen in the Turkey of slick concrete apartment towers and modest old wooden houses, broad avenues and narrow back streets, exorbitant wealth and dismal poverty. They are seen in the struggle between East and West, the desire and the necessity for change and economic survival in the globalized world versus a certain nostalgia for the traditional Turkish way of life in the strong attachment to the Muslim faith versus an admiration for the European Christian world. Yet in this tug of war, I believe that the dignity of the Ottoman Turkey that you knew, Lady Mary, still lies under the surface of the young, westernized Turks of today. Just scratch a bit, and a Turk will always be a Turk, no matter how much his world changes or how sophisticated his outlook becomes. The people of Turkey, a country sitting on 2 continents, have always had the rare opportunity to see the world with 2 sets of eyes, Eastern and Western. They peer out from behind a pair of double-vision bifocals, always tilting their head to adjust to the view of the moment, whether it be up close and immediate, or one far-reaching into the distance. And so, Lady Mary, I would like to share with you some of the rows of knots I have seen woven into this carpet. As you gave us insights into the daily life of the tulip era, I would like to describe to you some of the things I have witnessed in 4 distinct growth eras in my 30 years of travel to Turkey. I relate them not to serve as a political or historical analysis, but as descriptions of everyday life. These 4 periods are my own categories, and I beg forgiveness to those historians, economists, and sociologists who would disagree with my classification. Starting with my first trip in 1978, these periods are the dark years of 1978 through 1985, the wake-up decade of 1985 to 1995, the break-through-the-gate consumerism era of 1995 to 2000, and the drive to modernity from 2000 to the present and beyond. As I have told you, Lady Mary, my first visit to Turkey was in 1978, at a time I now look upon as the dark years. I call these difficult times the dark years, not just because times were indeed tough, but because they literally were dark. There was not a light bulb to be had in all the country. My friends and family, especially my worried mother, would say to me at this time, "Why in the world would you travel to a country with such problems? Apparent danger and instability, not to mention all those earthquakes." And right she was, my mother. The 1970s were a tough period for Turkey. In the years preceding my first visit, Turkey had gone through a decade of confusion, political conflict, violence, and bleakness, all seemingly bent on undermining Turkey's sense of purpose and Ataturk's secular identity. From the outside, it looked like it was a society on the road to self-destruction. The year I arrived, martial law was instigated in the Kurdish areas. There were fights between the left and the right, political violence on the streets, constant government changes, boycotts, clogged courts, strikes, arrests, unemployment, rampant inflation, insufficient social and educational opportunities, bleak jails, skyrocketing oil costs, and internal friction with Sunni Alevis and Kurds. Nothing seemed to be going right. In France, where I was living at the time, these difficult political times were reported in the press, but there were also signs of it closer to home. Between 1975 and 1981, Armenian gunmen went after and killed Turkish diplomats in Paris on 3 occasions, and bombed the Turkish Airlines office on the Champs-Élysées not 10 minutes after I had passed in front of it on a leisurely stroll down the avenue. If this were not enough, the most devastating incident was the accident of Turkish Airlines Flight 981 on March 3, 1974. I will never forget hearing the news of it over the radio as I awoke on that bright spring Sunday morning. Crashing in the forests of Armenoville just north of Paris, the accident killed all 346 on board. This crash was by far the worst air disaster in all history, and did much to sully the reputation of Turkish Airlines and the country of Turkey, who came off looking incompetent and irresponsible. But the worst attack onto Turkey's image came from the arts. The film Midnight Express was released in 1979. This film by Alan Parker, depicting the torture and violence prevalent in Turkish prisons, turned into a national hate film, bringing the West's worst fears and prejudices concerning Turkey to the forefront. It closed horizons and has left lasting scars on the image of Turkey until this day. All this midnight darkness led to the military coup of September 12, 1980. Entitled Operation Flag, this day led to a period of 3 years of military rule from 1980 to 83. Tanks rolled into place at street corners. Soldiers with machine guns stood on every street. Internal communications were cut. A 10 p.m. curfew was installed, and there was a ban on foreign travel. I stayed in Turkey during the early period of the coup for the month of December 1980. Unaware of the gravity of the situation, I decided to visit a friend for a week and discover what life in Istanbul was like in the winter. Little did I realize what was in store for me. What I had read in the papers about the coup had led me to believe that life was continuing as usual. In many ways, things were normal, but daily life was anything but easy. The first thing that struck me was the presence of soldiers with machine guns everywhere, on the runways of the airport, in every public space, on every street corner, in front of every large shop, constantly patrolling back and forth. Grave-sounding public announcements, blaring from electronic megaphones, assailed you on the street. As my Turkish at that time was non-existent, it was impossible for me to understand their gist. But the tone was enough to let me know that they meant business. The intolerable smell of lignite coal, used for heating, added to the dismal streetscape. It was cold, very cold, and one evening the snow started and did not stop falling for 3 days, covering the streets with a brief moment of beauty, before the mud chummed it back up into a dismal mess. I am not sure if it was the terrible cold, the snowfall, or the fear and uncertainty, but an eerie silence reigned on the sidewalks of Istanbul. The talking, laughing, and boisterous chaos of normal Turkish street life was silenced. Inside Turkish homes, it was hardly any warmer. A state of penury reigned, and everyone tried their determined best to confront the situation without complaint. It was an example of that strong commitment to social cohesion I spoke about earlier, Lady Mary. The ancestral clan spirit of Turks comes to the surface and bonds them together in times of challenge and hardship. The most difficult hurdle of all was the lack of heat. There was no fuel oil, and is always the case in such trying times, that winter passed with unforgiving, bitter cold. Lady Mary, you spoke once about how you sat in your sunny Para garden on a January afternoon and enjoyed the mild and sweet weather. But I can tell you this was not the luck of the climatic draw this January. A very creative ritual was inaugurated to ensure survival during this time. Every evening, the extended family of my friend would gather together in one of their homes, rotating from home to home each night. They would turn on the precious rationed heat so that everyone could benefit from some warmth for at least a few hours. Wearing multiple layers of sweaters, gloves, scarves, and socks, we huddled together in a one-room chock-a-block on the low couches, drank tea, chatted, and watched television for updates on the situation. Night after night was spent like this, with no other activity possible, as most normal activities were suspended during the coup. The oddest thing, though, was the lack of light bulbs. In each home, there was usually one light bulb to be had, and like a magical talisman, it was ceremoniously unscrewed and screwed into the lamp of the room where needed, forcing everyone to stick together to see or read. Night fell early, around 4 p.m., and the streets became so dark and gray that you were forced to return to an equally dark home. In the late afternoon, there was not much to do other than sit quietly in a room in the shadows, bundled in your overcoat, with a rare candle for company. Not only was there no fuel for heat, but there was none for hot water, so bathing became a brisk challenge. There was food, but no butter or coffee or much soap. Restaurants were completely empty. Museums were closed, and the opening hours of shops and banks were unreliable. When it came time for me to leave, I went to the airport for my flight, only to discover that the airport had been closed, and all flights were suspended until further notice. So what had been planned as a simple week getaway turned into a month-long trial before I could finally find a flight to take me home to Paris. Although a mood of despair and depression reigned, those Turks never lost their enthusiasm for life during the coup. It was during the coup that I traveled over the Bosphorus Bridge for the first time in that rattletrap car, and my friend's aunt, who was studying classical Ottoman dance, gave me dance lessons each afternoon. Her delight and sense of grace when she danced was a symbol for me of all the optimism of Turkey. And I was convinced that the people of Turkey would help the country dance through this period of darkness and cold. I have strong memories of these dark years of the coup from subsequent visits. The very darkness itself, for example. Even after the coup and the return of light bulbs, there were often no lights in banks or public buildings, and power outages were frequent. Many a dinner was eaten around candlelight, not to enhance romance, but out of necessity. The streets of Istanbul were congested by lumbering large American cars of the 50s, which operated as dolmuş, communal taxis, old DeSotos, regal 58 Chevys, and imperial purple Pontiacs. Lovingly kept in top form by this nation of skilled tinkerers, these thoroughbred modern stallions dabbed flashy highlights of color on the blue Bosphorus canvas. Swarming the streets of Istanbul were flocks of itinerant peddlers, hawking sesame rings, freshly cut cucumbers, milk, single cigarettes, water, newspapers, boza, a fermented winter drink, and lottery tickets in sing-song chants. In the teeming commercial areas of Beyoğlu and Eminönü, hamals, porters, bustled around, carrying merchandise on their backs like human camels, weaving around the dense bazaar neighborhoods more efficiently and quickly than could any truck or cart. I once saw a hamal, porter, carrying an entire dining room set, complete with a table, credenza, and chairs, on his back. They have all disappeared now. Public writers and scribes set up their tables in most parks and market spaces, pecking away at their typewriters to produce everything from official petitions to municipal authorities to love letters to distant sweethearts for the villagers who clustered around them. Despite the traces of its Ottoman imperial glory and memories of the picturesque streets depicted in the novels of Pierre Loti, much of Istanbul remained a tumble-down town during these years. There were abandoned buildings, crumbling walls, littered open areas, and back streets full of vines and garbage. Dilapidated wooden houses, their door and window casings out of whack, and leaned so precipitously forward that you were frightened to walk down the street for fear they would fall on you. Adding to the urban challenge was the beginning of the invasion of rural peasants and the growth of Gecekondu slum areas. In 1978, when I first visited Istanbul, the population was 4 million. By 1998, it had grown to 12 million. Cigarette smoke was everywhere. The clouds of cigarette smoke coming from the back deck of the Bosphorus ferries were as impressive as those coming from their smokestacks. Clients and shopkeepers puffed away while making transactions, and bank tellers blew smoke at you while they counted out your lira. I was even examined in 1979 by a doctor who held a cigarette in one hand while he felt my swollen glands with the other. My nurse friends in Eyüp smoked in front of their workstations. It was an unavoidable part of Turkish life, drenching you with its odor in taxis, shops, airports, post offices, buses, and restaurants. The most surprising smoker I ever encountered was a librarian who chain-smoked with the greatest of ease while cataloging rare books. They were perhaps ramshackle, those streets, but they teemed with life and joy. These were the days before plastic bags and plastic bottles, when every purchase was neatly wrapped in newspaper or a sweetly designed wrapping paper, tied with string so that it looked like a present. Purchases at the pharmacy, even one as small as a box of aspirin, were wrapped in paper to ensure discretion. There were cats everywhere, hundreds of cats, scrawny, dirty, limping, one-eyed, gaunt mousers with notched ears, blood-caked noses, crooked tails, and matted fur. Or every once in a while, an absolutely gorgeous Angora cat enthroning in the doorway of a shop as regally as any sultan on his dais. In restaurants or in shops, you always felt the swish of fur weaving around your ankles. In cities outside of Istanbul, a rural atmosphere persisted. On my first visit to Sivas, the road in front of the hotel was not paved, and cows grazed peacefully around the Guk Madrasa in town. There were more horse carts than cars in those days on the streets of Anatolia. The dark years were obvious to tourists as well. As hard as the Turks tried to put on a good show, it was not always possible to cover up the stained and lovingly mended bed sheets, the dust balls in the Topkapi Palace, the plague of mosquitoes in Laleli hotels, or the showerhead that sprayed the whole room, toilet included. No wonder rooms were built with a big drain in the floor and came with a pair of plastic sandals by the bed. Back home, you never saw glamorous articles in the newspapers or magazines on travel to Turkey, and there were perhaps only 2 guidebooks to Turkey in print. You stood out in airports and bus stations with your matched luggage sets, alongside the Turks who traveled carting bundles, sisal sacks, cardboard boxes tied with twine, and duffel bags. Restaurant tables had blue plastic buckets filled of sliced bread and aluminum pitchers with fountain water. Despite the time-consuming torture of changing money, you avoided changing too much at a time because the inflation rate varied wildly from day to day. Bus rides across the Anatolian plains were made insufferable by the cigarette smoke and the lack of air conditioning in the bus coaches. Yet Turkey survived that martial law period and those problematic years, and in many ways it was the last time that Turkey would ever remain dark and cold, for after this time, Turkish society experienced an opening towards a brighter future. Despite the political turmoil, I kept returning, convinced ever since that the first ride across the Bosphorus Bridge I told you about, Lady Mary, that this country was destined to be something big. A new constitution was written in 1982. The Southeastern Anatolia Project, GAP, Dam Project, was inaugurated, and coffee beans made an appearance once again in 1981, if only for the tourists. That year was also designated as the Year of Ataturk, for the centennial anniversary of his birth, and the flurry of schools and parks opened that year all bore a proud Yüzyıl, 100 years, in front of their names. Yes, after this period, there was no looking back. Turkish society experienced an opening to the future and took off like an airplane down the runway to a new horizon. Around the year 1985, the promise of a bright future started to become a reality. Turkey opened up to the world via trade and tourism. Bent on erasing the bad memory of those dark years, the horses broke forth from the starting gate at an amazing pace. I look at the decade from 1985 to 1995 as the wake-up years. After the Constitution was rewritten in 1982, a political force named Turgut Özal came upon the scene with his newly formed ANAP Motherland Party. This reformist leader opened up the Turkish economy to free trade, removed heavy dependence on foreign aid, and released the pent-up energy of a young and ambitious generation of entrepreneurs. His vision coincided with the computer revolution, with technology beginning to drive all sectors. Factories popped up in every corner of Turkey, and exports increased, notably in textiles and foodstuffs. For a country that counted wheat and hazelnuts as its major exports before his arrival, Turgut Özal's program was a revolution. Overnight, Turkey became too big for the blue jeans it now famously exported to the world market, splitting at its seams from the rapid growth and change brought on after the dark years. Upwardly striving in earnest, Turks became business-minded on a big scale and proved to themselves and to the world that their richest natural resources were not oil, minerals, or diamonds, but hard work, determination, and scrappiness. The Turkish tiger cub was born. Tourists today see a Turkey of promise and sophistication, but that was not always the case. I witnessed the opening of the Turkish stock market, the integration of Turkey into world markets, and the privatization of industry. In daily life, I observed the birth of civic associations and foundations, and the creation of media, satellite TV, and private TV stations with open advertising. Stores were flooded with imported goods and services, including computers. I remember walking in Jakirga, in Bursa, and seeing a sign advertising classes for knowledge counters, and being puzzled at what this was. It was only later that I realized that this was the Turkish neologism for computer, and most importantly, Turkey courted Europe for the first time. The Prime Minister, Özal, in an improbable romantic lead role, applied for membership in the European Commission in 1987. The biggest change for me during this time was the explosive building projects that rocked the country like an earthquake. Turkey literally built itself up from the ground overnight. Like the Seljuk Sultans before them, Turkey's leaders and businessmen rebuilt the entire infrastructure of the country. Roads were repaired, airports built, and electrical pylons improved. The dreadful airport serving the capital of the country at Ankara was thankfully rebuilt. In 1987, there were only 2 5-star hotels in Istanbul. Today, there are more than 20, and they are filled to capacity. The shores of the Aegean and the Mediterranean seas, which were virtually empty after World War II, now saw a total ribbon development. The country experienced an intended policy of decentralization, with cities such as Bursa, Kayseri, and Adana coming to the forefront to compete with their big brothers of Ankara and Istanbul. The Ataturk Dam, the centerpiece of the Southeastern Anatolia Project, GAP, of 22 dams and 19 hydroelectric stations, was completed in 1990. GAP began churning forth irrigation water and electricity to arid southeastern Turkey, reinforcing the power of another Turkish natural resource, water. GAP is one of the largest development projects in the world, and it put Turkey on the map, not only for its innovation, but also for its controversy, as it flooded historical sites and diverted the water supplies of downriver neighbors. Istanbul benefited from a major facelift during this time. The leather-curing tanneries, located outside the city walls at Yedikul, were displaced between 1985 and 1991. And thankfully, you were no longer subjected to their stench as your first impression of Istanbul on the drive-in from the airport. UNESCO declared the Byzantine city walls of Istanbul as a World Heritage Site in 1985. This led to an earnest preservation and parks program, but also to the demolition of many of the older buildings nearby. The stagnant waters of the Golden Horn were cleaned up, and the narrow coastal roads up the Bosphorus were widened starting in 1983 or so. Unfortunately, they displaced the charming quayside tables of seafood restaurants to the opposite side of the road. But all was still not perfectly rosy. Prices rose, with double-digit inflation. There was an increase in unemployment, and the rural poor continued to flood to the cities, creating an ever-increasing social cleavage between the conservative Islamic lifestyle and westernized secular elite. There were issues with Bulgarian refugees in the summer of 1989 and the start of Kurdish warfare. Attacks on Turkish companies continued in Paris, with the Orly airport bomb attack of 1983 leaving 8 dead. Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, provoking the first of the Iraqi-U.S. wars. And in 1994, a financial crisis and recession halved the value of the lira over a few months and plunged the country into a tailspin. The black market exchange rate continued to offer some 30% difference over the bank rates of 1988. But Turkey soldiered on to progress in ways other than exports and building. The pint-sized wrestler Naim Suleimanoglu, lovingly nicknamed the Pocket Hercules, captured the nation's imagination and pride when he earned Olympic gold medals in 1988, 1992, and 1996. Like Turkey, he showed that the little guy can win big on the world's playing fields. Politically, too, Turkey was sending messages to the world. Turkey elected a woman prime minister, Tansu Çiller, in 1993 to 1996, a feminism light years ahead of any Western country. The Turkish government started to send cultural exhibits abroad, which proved to be a clever way to stimulate interest in the country to foreign culture consumers. I remember with pride attending the gala opening of the huge Age of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent exhibit in January 1987 at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., with dignitaries from all the cultural and political spheres of the world in attendance. In my own country of America, the same overwhelming political, economic, and physical changes were occurring in the 1980s, spurred by the advent of the computer age. When I think how our lives changed by those knowledge counters, it makes the rapid changes of Turkey seem all the more dizzying. After Özal woke Turkey up in the 1980s, it seemed that everything of the old regime was thrown out the window. It was during this time that I both marveled at the progress. At the same time, I began to be filled with a certain nostalgia. Everyone now wanted to live in concrete block apartments or suburban developments instead of wooden homes, which were now turned into hotels for tourists. No one wanted to shop in the covered bazaar, but in the market. No one took pride in wearing traditional clothes and jewelry. Plastic bags replaced hand-woven saddlebags. These changes impacted foreign travelers such as myself. I was happy to see that new taximeters were installed in cabs, putting an end to haggling, arguments, and profiteering. I was pleased that I no longer had to stay in dingy hotels and that toilets and showers worked. I was relieved that citizens could now travel efficiently and cheaply on the subways of Ankara and Istanbul. I was eager to discover Kurdish music starting in 1991, when the ban against the sale of music cassettes of this distinctive music was lifted. The favorite gift to bring Turks still remained American cigarettes, lighters, and vitamins, largely unavailable at that time. The first ever U.S. check-in counter of Turkish Airlines, THY, at Newark Airport still resembled a bus terminal in the heart of Turkey, full of pandemonium, travelers lugging microwaves in cardboard boxes, and burlap bags wrapped in tape. There was not even a permanent sign for THY over the counter. A piece of cardboard, handwritten with black marker and attached with twine swinging over the check-in desk, did the job. There were no direct THY flights from the United States to Istanbul or Ankara, with stopovers necessary in Brussels. The streetscape also changed. Starting around 1989, and especially after the fall of communism in Russia in 1991, the Laleli neighborhood became invaded by Eastern Europeans. There were still no street signs, but I began to see dogs kept as pets, French poodles for the first time. There were fewer stray cats. And my favorite Kayseri Iskender kebab salon became equipped with air conditioning and fancy pink window blinds. Towns such as Nida and Afyon, which seemed lost in the infinite dusty plains on that first trip in 1978, now seemed like built-up metropoli. All over Turkey, massive building projects were undertaken, yet countless sites stood half-completed and deserted. Major museums remained closed for renovations, posted with signs saying they would reopen at a date 2 years previous to the day you were standing in front of their doors. Perhaps the biggest change of all for me was in the city of Antalya, which exploded with the appearance of a series of flashy 5-star hotels in 1991, such as the Falaise and the Sheraton Voyager. When I first went to Turkey in 1978, Antalya was a bustling town with a stunning historic inner harbor full of Seljuk monuments and fishing boats, with its neighboring seafront undeveloped. I stayed in a small hotel on the Lara Road to the east of town, very run down, but full of charm due to its impressive Corniche setting. The centerpiece of this modest motel was a large plane tree on its cliffside terrace, perhaps some 300 years old. It had a distinctive shape with long horizontal branches that stretched all the way over to the edge of the cliff, as if it wanted to offer as much protection as possible. It was under the shade of those wide boughs and their broad leaves that I ate my meals, caught the cool breezes, read, lounged, and contemplated the perfect view over the Antalya harbor. That tree provided a haven of total peace, love, and quietude I have rarely felt. Years later, in 1991, fleeing those impersonal, modern hotels, I decided to return for a stay in that unpretentious spot, to savor once again that quietude under its tree. My heart sank when I arrived in front of the entry road to the property and saw that the grounds were boarded up and surrounded by barbed wire. A sign was posted on the fence: "Construction site, no entry, dangerous demolition in progress." My tree, my beloved tree, was it being bulldozed over into the sea? I became very sad that day, and was left to wonder if Turkey understood that progress had certain responsibilities to heritage and tradition, without which evolution becomes an empty promise. Starting around 1995, once Uzal's racehorses had left the gates, they started to pound down the track as if there was no reining them in. Another societal change occurred in Turkey that lasted for about 5 years. Something had snapped. Things started snowballing to a point where there was no turning back. The door to consumerism had been thrown wide open by Uzal, and Turks, with their love of progress and change, ran right through it. Turkey was on a committed path to modernism, racing to become bigger and better than anything in Europe or America. And in some ways, it succeeded. In a period of about 5 years, the slumbering giant that woke up in the previous decade took its place on the world stage and shouted, "Get out of my way, here I come." Like a teenager, Turkey started to seek its way, stretching, growing towards adulthood, all through a swift and explosive integration into the global culture of consumerism. Daily life changed beyond recognition, even in the short period between my visits. If I had returned to Turkey after an absence 20 years, instead of every year, I would not have believed my eyes. This period of rapid evolution coincided as well with the arrival of the Internet and the World Wide Web as an explosive global driving force. It was an era of more and more conspicuous consumption, driven by a new elite rising from meritocracy and education, just like the Janissaries had under the Ottomans. A big year driving this change was 1996, the year of the United Nations Habitat II Conference in Istanbul. In order to show that Istanbul was a player on the world's cultural stage, the city was seriously gussied up. Street signs were hung, Public transportation improved, and many stray dogs and cats were eliminated from the streets overnight. Familiar neighborhood signposts disappeared at the same time those street signs were being put in place. And in many ways, this purified Istanbul lost much of the mystery that so intrigued Pierre Loti. By 1996, the population of Istanbul had grown from the 4 million when I first went there in 1978 to over 12 million. The density of the city had become palpable. One of the characteristics of this period to me was the evidence of a new wealth, visible in many ways, especially in the building boom of houses, apartments, and urban commercial centers. Luxurious gated communities in the Levant area of Istanbul, called cité, pronounced as the French cité, provided a complete living environment with homes, roads, individual lawns and gardens, movie theaters, shopping plazas, health clubs, tennis courts, and pools. At this time, Turkey witnessed a rapid growth in the construction of shopping malls, planned as the forums of social life. In the late 1990s, they popped up everywhere, starting with the Galleria, 1988, Akmerkez and Kanyon in Istanbul, Metro and Atakule in Ankara, and the 42-floor Site Kulesi in Konya in 2006. The male-dominated atmosphere of the bazaar now flipped over to the more woman-centered atmosphere of these malls, and I saw women as sales clerks for the first time. The shiny, polished marble floors of these malls did not resemble the muddy streets of the old city centers, and you usually had to reach them by car, not on foot, another increased sign of consumerism. Malls came with food courts filled with Western restaurant chains, but also with some reassuring kebab stands. Foreign retailers rushed in to populate the stores of these malls, from Starbucks to Harvey Nichols. In addition to the malls, this period saw the complete transformation of the corner Bakkal Amca grocery store, uncle store, to the market, to the supermarket, such as Izmar, and finally to the hypermarket, Migros and Carrefour. The hotel building boom continued as well, now with a focus on luxury or boutique hotels. The more lavish the appointments, the better. All in all, this building boom reoriented the urban grid. The glue of the three traditional cohesive elements of the Ottoman town, the neighborhood, the market, and the local mosque, was now coming apart, to be reshaped in a different pattern. Little children no longer grew up in the Sultanahmet neighborhood of Istanbul, which turned into a stage set of Ottoman homes for tourists. I witnessed these changes to communication, fashion, food, and leisure in ways large and small, yet it was always the fever of consumerism that characterized this era in my eyes. Everyone had to obtain a cell phone, a car, and had to now shop at the supermarket. Istanbul had always been a commercial gateway, and now outsider Europeans and Westerners knocked at its door to sell not just their products, but their lifestyles to an eager society. Despite the zeal for progress and consumerism, there still remained a vast discrepancy between the great wealth and fortunes flashed by the new rich of Istanbul and the hopeless poverty of the rural areas, usually in the east. Consume they did, those Turks, but produce they did as well. It was during this period that Turkey surprised the world with its technological savvy and advances at home and abroad, becoming a cutting-edge player with its telecommunications industry. When the new ultra-modern Terminal 1 opened at JFK Airport in New York in 1998, THY stepped up to be one of the 5 international airlines signed on as tenants next to the prestigious Air France and Lufthansa. THY flights to Istanbul became non-stop, with every seat filled. The bus terminal atmosphere of the past at the check-in process was replaced with slick, elegant, and swift service, and Turks now traveled with designer luggage. In a show of the astonishing technological innovation appearing at this time in Turkey, I used an automatic cash machine to withdraw money for the first time in my life in the dusty farm town of Affion, not on Wall Street in Manhattan. Again, for the first time, I used the energy-saving system of key-activated light switches, not in Las Vegas or Paris, but in a Kayseri hotel, and cooled myself with efficient, above-window air conditioners in Aksaray. In 1999, the Taksim to Levant subway opened, and I waited for a red light to change in my car while counting down the seconds on an LED display counter for the first time, not in New York, but in a small town on the Black Sea coast. The Silver Bullet fast tram from Sirkeci to Eminönü roared down Istanbul's historic Divan Yolu on its inaugural voyage, down the very street where your Janissaries once marched, Lady Mary. The streetscapes changed rapidly as well. I began to see street pushcarts selling Western foods, such as corn on the cob, hot potatoes, and popcorn. Dogs were paraded on leashes, and fancy cars parked in front of old wooden houses. Natural gas replaced the slow-burning lignite coal that gave the distinctive smell to Istanbul in winter. Internet cafes sprung up everywhere after 1995. And satellite dishes on the rooftops of houses blossomed as fast as the geraniums in the olive oil cans at their doorsteps. Bicycles started to appear in 1996, at the same time as baby carriages, something never seen before in Turkey, a culture where women held their babies up close in their arms or on their hips. The Sultanahmet area was refurbished in 1997 with the creation of a new park and the remaining litter cleaned up. A discreet railing was put around the sunken stargazing pool of the Konya Karate Madrasa as a concession to clumsy tourists. A new floor was laid in the covered bazaar in 1998. Not only were new products and patterns of consumerism flooding into Turkey, but also came globalized images, names, pop stars, foods, and life patterns via satellite TV and the media. Turkish youth started to adopt the international dress code of jeans, t-shirts, sports shoes, and baseball caps, and tattoos. Chubby children became more common. Sparkling magazines flashed forth on the newsstands, Turkish versions of Cosmo, Marie Claire, as well as decorating journals and glossy fashion magazines battled cheek to jowl for attention. Turkish designers strutted down the international fashion runways, starting in the mid-1990s with Rafat Uzbek and Atil Kudulu, creating imaginative collections with an oriental flair and imagination. At the same time, I noticed imported Turkish blue jeans and polo shirts for sale in my local Kmart store. Turks interpreted the Western consumer yuppie lifestyles a la Turca. Women started to focus on their bodily health and beauty, not only in the articles from those fancy fashion magazines, but also articles in the general press, advertising, and with the arrival of international beauty products. As unbelievable as it may seem in this country of the nargileh, and whose name is synonymous with tobacco, the Turks enforced smoking bans in public places far earlier than Europe, right behind the Americans. Cafes and fast food restaurants appeared, and new food products appeared in Turkey before I saw them in New York. Cell phones became universal. Chocolate cakes, cubed sugar, and Nescafe became the status symbols of the day. The Turks not only acquired consumer goods, but they also sought to attain better educational opportunities for their children. Private universities appeared on the educational horizon at the same time that Turks fled in record numbers to attend institutions of higher learning in America, as the possession of an American diploma was deemed the passport to success in Turkey. Like the Ottoman princes sent to the provincial towns to learn their trade with a tutor, the contemporary heirs apparent were sent to the USA to attend the finest schools and to rack up the highest diplomas. This change did not take place just in Istanbul, but all over the country. However, it took a different spin out in Anatolia, where there was an even more concerted effort to reject the past, in favor of Western lifestyle patterns to prove their modernity. Practical and perfect items replaced traditional housewares. Old hand-beaten copper pots were tossed out in favor of aluminum sets given away by newspapers. Inox cutlery replaced hand-carved wooden spoons. Wall-to-wall carpeting took the place of hand-woven kaleems and rugs. And ornate couches and chairs replaced the traditional low sedir banquettes that you so enjoyed sitting on, Lady Mary. On a visit to Konya in 1981, I was almost run over by the confusion of hundreds of horse carts in front of the Sahip Atta Kuliyesi, an area for repair shops and replacement parts. There was not one car there in the midst of those hundreds of carts. But when I returned there in 1995, the entire area was empty, with not one horse cart in sight. Of course, change willy-nilly brings unintended consequences. The most regretted change I have noticed in Anatolia at this time was the appearance of roadside visual pollution. It used to be that you could travel for hours and not see one billboard, only miles and miles of pure countryside. Countryside so pure that you felt detached from the world and could stretch your eyes and imagination to the horizon and beyond. Now, billboards popped up everywhere, full of vulgar and unnecessary information. Not only were these billboards polluting the countryside, but so was garbage, notably those indestructible plastic bags and water bottles. Garbage was never seen on the roads of Turkey. Now it is everywhere. I witnessed another regrettable change in Konya in 1996. The sparkling rainbows of hand-woven prayer carpets that covered the floors of the Ala ad-Din Mosque had been removed and were replaced by a monotonous sea of teal-blue carpeting. This royal mosque, the most famous and sacred of all the Seljuk mosques, with its famous carved walnut mimbar from 1155, its mihrab of spectacular underglazed turquoise tiles, and its original carpets ordered by the Sultan Ala ad-Din Keykubat himself, was now stripped of its aesthetic historical glory by the laying of that industrial carpet, all in the name of progress. In the consumerism and change during the years of 1995 to 2000, it was perhaps the evolving political scene that is the most lasting legacy of this period, the one that will have the largest impact on the future of Turkey. These 5 years witnessed a country struggling to come to grips with change that was often too dizzying to absorb. Western consumerism had left a large part of society, especially those outside of the urban centers, feeling excluded. Not unexpectedly, many turned to something more reassuring, more familiar, and more in tune with their value system, and sought a tolerance of different lifestyles and economic stability. It should not have appeared as a surprise to anyone that Turkey elected Necmettin Erbakan, its first Islamic prime minister, in July 1996, ushering in a new tone of government. The fourth and final period of evolution I witnessed took place in the years 2000 to the present, after the shattering events of the 1999 Izmit earthquake and September 11, 2001 in New York. Turkey and the world have not been the same after these two events, and they led the final frantic drive to modernity that Turkey wished to achieve. In my eyes, this period is characterized by a massive tourism flood, an intense drive to woo Europe, a sentiment of anti-Americanism caused by the Second Iraq War, the emergence of religious political parties as a power, and the arrival of Turkey on the political and economic world stage front and center. The political atmosphere changed rapidly and saw the abolition of the death penalty in 2002. Although the Kurdish insurgency ended in 1999 with the emergency rule lifted in November 2002, it was still very common to see machine gun-carrying soldiers in hotel lobbies and public spaces through 2004, the year that the TRT state television broadcast a Kurdish language program for the first time. After a financial crisis in 2001 caused Turkey's currency to lose half its value, the country introduced IMF-inspired reforms that were doggedly maintained. As a result, Turkey has not only experienced impressive GDP growth, but rid itself of the hyperinflation that plagued it for most of the 1990s. The changes of the previous decade continued to steam forth. The building boom persists, with vast housing construction projects in progress on plots of land outside of cities such as Kayseri, Malatya, and Konya, and office building towers in Ankara and Istanbul, and even more shopping malls and hypermarkets all over the country. The roads crisscrossing the country are now on par with those of Europe. Technology continues to steam forward. 2001 witnessed the opening of a new subway in Ankara and an international airport in Istanbul. In a sign of the times, mosques now post notices saying, "Lütfen cep telefonunuzu kapatınız." Please turn off your cell phones. And in a small town outside of Tokat, an LCD zip banner sign on the local mosque announces the prayer times in glaring red letters. On January 1st, 2005, Turkish currency dropped 6 zeros, and the new YTL currency was released. With astonishing efficiency, I was able to withdraw my first bills of new Turkish lira from an ATM at 10 a.m. that morning. Never did I expect that machine would be capable of spitting out the new currency. But all went smoothly, much more smoothly than Europe when it changed over to the euro. No advertisement appears now without its internet site address. And Wi-Fi connections are more universal and reliable than they are in America, and certainly far ahead of Europe. Turkey has become aware of the green movement, continuing to tidy up urban areas, creating new gardens, parks, and pedestrian malls, such as the Istiklal and French streets in Istanbul, and planting traffic strips on approaches to cities. It is now common to see expat workers from Western countries living in Istanbul, and some 300,000 to 400,000 people emigrate to Istanbul each year. The silver bullet train is now comfortably air-conditioned. International market development continues, with Turks exporting 90% of their cars to Europe. In April 2007, I saw a bottle of Turkish Efes beer for sale in the tiny corner grocery shop on the street where I live in New York. The departures board at the Istanbul airport now has every conceivable destination posted, far from that cardboard sign at the THY counter at Newark. But the biggest change of this period is the massive tourism that has hit Turkey. You cannot walk the streets of Istanbul anymore without being jostled by foreigners. Istanbul is the new Rome. Ever the hospitable hosts, the Turks are doing their utmost to welcome these tourists. Turkey has developed an excellent transportation system with sophisticated intra-city buses, trains, tramways, ferry boats, sea buses, taxis, and a newly developing underground. Railroads and major highways are undergoing upgrades, with many 4-lane highways and toll roads in place to ease their travel. There are multilingual smiling policemen to ensure their safety. The tourist information booth in Sultanahmet is a marvel of efficiency. Historic Ottoman homes and Hans in Safranbolu, Diyarbakir, and Amasya serve as guest houses. Starbucks awaits tourists on the Divan Yolu and Istiklal streets, should the traditional little glasses of tea, Nescafe, and Turkish coffee not be to their fancy. Ice machines are appearing in hotels. Tourists can dance to international hits and Turkish rap in the countless Junise Dore discos opened for them. A felicitous offshoot of this opening of Turkey as a world cultural destination is a heightened awareness in the presentation of their national heritage. In addition to improvements to the outstanding state museums in Ankara, Istanbul, and Antalya, a series of privately funded museums, Kadir Has in Kayseri, Koç, Sabancı, Pera, and Sadburghana museums in Istanbul have opened their doors to greet foreigners and Turks whose interest in their cultural identity has been awakened. Turkey is becoming a world cultural player with these museums, especially with the new 2004 Istanbul Modern, the first of its kind in Turkey to showcase contemporary art. The traditional arts are not neglected, however, with plans afoot in Istanbul to create a museum dedicated to flat weave carpets. Tourism and museum brochures, formerly riddled by the most egregious of language mistakes, are now slick and linguistically polished. Audio guides impeccably present visits in numerous foreign tongues. Guidebooks are published in every language. The people of Turkey are also becoming more culturally aware, along with the tourists. Book production is more sophisticated, with artistically designed colorful covers and quality white paper, a vast improvement over the dull jackets and grainy newsprint paper of yore. Previously, approximately 10,000 books were published each year in Turkey. In 2006, some 30,000 went to press. Fancy bookstores are popping up everywhere, with window fronts presenting engaging displays of graphically appealing titles. Spurred by the declaration of UNESCO of 9 properties in Turkey as World Heritage Sites, and the resulting interest of world scholars in archaeological digs, there is a greater consciousness in Turkey that traditional legacies must be saved, valued, and appreciated. Turks are becoming more and more aware that their culture is one of vast richness that must be cherished and preserved with attention and professionalism. I note many changes to my guideposts. Good bread is getting harder to find. Ayran now comes in sterilized cups, not homemade in pitchers. This year, for the first time, I hear police and ambulance sirens on the streets. Old wooden houses and strolling lottery salesmen have become rarities. Fruit juice comes in cardboard boxes, not in tiny, colorful, cone-shaped glass bottles. You cannot get a drink of water anywhere without it coming out of a plastic bottle, as if those cool aluminum pitchers on restaurant tables or the glasses from itinerant peddlers are now deemed unsanitary. Babies have become fussy, children sassier and fatter. The Spice Bazaar is losing its integrity, with its famous mountain peaks of colored spices fading to a blur of tourist trinkets and T-shirts. Jewelry shops are even crawling in. This year, one with an obtrusive glassed-in front appeared, in total disrespect to the architectural integrity of this historical monument. In all this change, I pray that the local individuality of each region in Turkey, so rich and distinctive, will be able to withstand globalization and its international standardized stamp of uniformity, for this regional diversity is one of the great resources of Turkey. Local customs and costumes, folk songs, dialects, accents, foods, music, and artistic patterns must stay vibrant. I want Konya to look differently from Şanlıurfa. I do not want Grey Erzurum to resemble Golden Ankara, nor do I want the regional accents to disappear from speech. I want to hear Alevi music in Elbistan and eat gummy ice cream in Kahramanmaraş and marvel at the blue Mediterranean in Antalya and the fawn plains in Nida. In this march to progress, I especially hope that the unspoiled sweetness and spirit of the Turkish people will never be lost. Thievery will happen. Burglary will happen. Mobsters will happen. Elements coming in from the West risk influencing traditional values. When I visited Isparta in 1991 and locked the car, the parking lot attendant laughed and mocked me, saying, "Foolish woman, you do not need to do that here. This is Turkey, where no one steals from one another." How I hope he will always be right. Yet there are but minor pebbles along the hurtling highway of progress. I, too, hop on board with all the same excitement as the Turks to this great Bosphorus ferry steaming towards the future. 2 major projects are planned for the Bosphorus, and they remind us how far Turkey has come since Suleiman the Magnificent dreamed of building a bridge across the Bosphorus. The Marmara project, planned for completion in 2012, will link the European and Asian sides of Istanbul by a 13-kilometer undersea rail tunnel across the Bosphorus, which will become the world's deepest immersed tube tunnel. A third bridge over the Bosphorus is planned for then as well. With this type of development, it is going to be soon very hard for France or Austria or anyone else in the world to ignore Turkey. A new generation of bridge crossers are currently hard at work drawing up the construction documents for these projects, and I can only hope that their experience with Turkey will be as rich as mine has been since the day I first worked on those translations for the Fatih Bridge. Are you dizzy reading all of this, Lady Mary? Please do not worry, for despite the changes I have just described, many of the impressions you enjoyed during your stay in Turkey will not change on this road to progress and change. There will always be those tiled walls of the Selimiye in Edirne for you to admire, that view from the heights of your Pera window, the pleasure boat rides up the blue Bosphorus, the charming women with diamonds large as hazelnuts, those Black Sea hazelnuts themselves, an obsession with children, a love of families, and those carpets laid out for picnics. I deeply admire the city of Kayseri, Lady Mary, and how I wish you could have visited it. I think that one of the reasons that I admire it so much is that it symbolizes the parade of continuity and change in such harmony. When I stand in the main square and look around me in all directions, I see the full scope of the history and power of Turkish progress. The volcanic Mount Erciyes represents the beginning of time. The bustling market echoes the footsteps of Assyrian and Hittite merchants. The stone city walls are testament to Rome and Byzantium. The Maperi Hatun and Sahibiye madrasas showcase the importance of the Seljuk capital. Sinan's Ali Pasha Mosque encapsulates the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire. The ideals of the Republic ride along with Ataturk on his equestrian statue in the center of the square. And the Turkey of European dreams glitters in the glass facade of the new Hilton Hotel, itself designed to mirror the profile of the majestic mountain of Erciyes across from it. I hope that every citizen of Turkey can look around him in his town and feel the same pride in this impressive march of history and progress. I have every confidence that the giant Turkey rug, now being woven 1,000 miles long and 300 wide, will become a magic carpet for the entire world to admire. I hope that the Turks will reflect upon the fact that the plain, teal, wall-to-wall carpeting now in place in the Ala-Eddin Mosque in Konya will not be remembered, as are the rugs woven during Sultan Ala-Eddin Keykubat's time that originally graced its floors. The good Sultan's rugs have gone down in the art history books as some of the finest examples of woven art. They are now the crown jewels of the Islamic Art Museum in Istanbul, drawing millions of visitors yearly. And so this is what I wish for Turkey, that she and her people continue to weave a shimmering carpet of country, of great individuality and distinction, original in design, and executed with the finest workmanship. I never forgot my tree in that rundown motel in Antalya. It has haunted my memory and my dreams ever since that day when I feared its destruction behind that barbed wire fence. And so this year, I went back to Antalya, determined to find it. I was convinced that it was still alive, for I had trouble believing that something that precious and noble could have been bulldozed during a construction project. I walked down the Lara Road to the point where I sensed it had been, and entered the grounds of a modern hotel now built there. Just when I was about to give up hope of finding it, suddenly, there in the maze in front of me, it stood. Not only had it been spared, but it had become the focal point of the entire landscaping design of the hotel. A sweet terrace veranda had been built around it to showcase its majesty, and it stood just as it had been before, still welcoming people to sit under its sheltering shade, to enjoy its peace and the magnificent view over the Antalya Bay. And so I would like to think that Turkey will share the same destiny as my tree, eternal, yet changing, gracefully evolving with time, adapting, always able to stand tall and proud, with its roots firmly planted in the ground for generations to come, as its branches reach for the moon and stars. Sincerely, Kadria Branning.